we are going to get into the performance. But before we do that, in the normal sequence of things, once the CDU pre-flight up to the N1 page is completed, and both pilots are on the flight deck, and both pilots have done their seat belts, shoulder harnesses, and rudder pedals, which means both pilots would have completed their pre-flight procedures. I'm not going to do that here because it is very straightforward in top to bottom, left to right. So for the case of this briefing, we will assume that both captain and first officer have completed their pre-flight procedures. And before we get into performance, we actually will do the first checklist, which is the pre-flight checklist. Now, what I've done here is color-coded the captain's position and the FO's position for the sake of all my briefings. Remember that on the ground, the captain is always the pilot flying. The first officer is always the pilot monitoring on the ground. In flight, captain or first officer could be pilot flying or pilot monitoring, and that will be color-coded as far as the pilot flying in orange and the pilot monitoring in green. And we'll be looking at that later on as we get going. So let's go ahead with the checklist, and as we do it, we'll go into the airplane and actually complete it. So the first officer does the pre-flight checklist. Incidentally, something I didn't mention in the previous video, once the crew had completed loading of the route and checking the route, incidentally, both pilots have to check the FMC. So the person do the walk around. When that person comes back, their responsibility would, before they do their pre-flight, they would check the CDU pre-flight in its entirety, similar to the way the person who loaded it. So both pilots must have checked the entire route, tracks, distances, and total distance. We'll assume that's done, and when it's done, both pilots will set up the map mode the way you see it here. I've chosen to use Map Center. You can use the expanded map. Follow your company standard operating procedures. Thank you for that. Now let's get on to today's briefing. Pre-flight checklist. Oxygen. Tested 100%, tested 100%. I can't show you the panel right now, but let's say it's been done. Nav transfer and display switches. Normal. Auto. A window heat. On. Pressurization mode selector. Auto. Flight instruments. Now at this point, the captain will go first, checking heading, altimeter, and really you check the Q&H. So the heading, you'd read the Q&H and read the actual altimeter, and the captain would do the standby also, and then the first officer would do his heading and Q&H and altimeter readout. So we'll do that. We'll go into the airplane and we'll do it left to right in that sequence. There's nothing laid down in the FCOM regarding that, but a standard way is everything is done left to right. And anytime both the captain and the first officer have a function to do, it's always the captain first and then the first officer second, from left to right. Generally, that's the flow sequence. Heading 173, QNH 1020, and altimeter 40 feet. And heading 173, altimeter 1020, and altimeter of 40 feet. Heading 173, altimeter setting 1020, and the altimeter 40 feet. Follow your company SOPs if there is something depicting how you should do it. This is one man's way of doing it, and it follows the normal flow. And I think most carriers would do it the same way. Parking brakes. Now, this is a captain's function, set. So let's go in and make sure that's the case. Set. Engine start levers. Cut off. Pre-flight checklist complete. Now is the time that the captain would initiate the OPT initial procedure. I break it down into two parts, and we'll talk about that as we go. The load figures, final load sheet, doesn't normally come to the aircraft in many cases 10 to 15 minutes prior to pushback. And in any case, we'll break it down in the way it happens in most flights. So if you notice on screen, I've got a table with the captain's duties and the first officer's duties. So after completion of the pre-flight checklist, which we have just completed, and after both pilots have checked the ATIS and copied it independently, and that's very important, that the pilots don't discuss what they're copying, because this will be a foolproof way of checking that both pilots are entering the correct information after hearing the same thing without discussing. So both pilots select the airplane from the tail configuration list, then select complete. This is to be done independently. Now, select the airport search and select the departure. This is to be done independently. The captain then would ask the first officer, in this particular company, they use this terminology, ready for the greens, and if the first officer is ready, he or she would say, go ahead. The captain will state the initial conditions that are to be used for initial data entry. And for this company, these items are in the green on the OPT. We'll see that later. So captain starts, airport, OOMS, and the first officer repeats. Captain, runway 08 left, first officer repeats as he's making the selections. That is, as both people are making those selections. The intersection full, 08 left, the first officer, intersection full, 08 left, and so on. The condition wet, condition wet. So this is a continuation, flap optimum, optimum, and so on, until all the greens are completed. And as the captain is reading, he or she is inserting, and then the first officer is inserting the same. Now, the next entries on the OPT are referred to with this company as the whites, and the ATIS is copied independently, so no discussion. captain or one person could say information bravo, but they're not to discuss it. And they would put in the three whites. There are three prompts for the wind, and the outside air temperature, and the QNH. And as far as the wind is concerned, not to apply any gusts. All right. So the next bit of information is after the final weights have been received. Now, what we've done up to this point could be called the first or initial part of the performance.